The First National Bank of Cedar Junction smelled of stale cigar smoke, oiled steel, and the quiet desperation of a Monday morning. Dust motes danced in the slanted shafts of sunlight, piercing the tall windows, illuminating the worn floorboards, and the stoic face of the teller behind the iron grill. James Whitlock stood in line, his gaze distant, his thoughts a world away, on the high prairie, where the wind scoured the land clean. He was here for the mundane business of depositing the meager profits from selling a few head of cattle, a transaction that felt as small and insignificant as he did in the grand scheme of things. Suddenly, the mundane shattered. The heavy oak doors burst inward with a splintering crash, and the quiet morning erupted into chaos. 4 men, their faces obscured by dusty bandanas, stormed the room, their movements practiced and brutal. One brandished a shotgun, its twin barrels gaping like the mouths of hell, and his voice boomed through the bank. "Nobody move, hands where I can see 'em." Panic, sharp and acrid, filled the air. A woman screamed. The teller's hands shot up his face, ashen. James reacted on pure instinct, his body tensing, his hand dropping toward the Colt holstered at his hip. But before he could draw the man nearest him, slammed the butt of a rifle into his side, driving the air from his lungs. He staggered, gasping against the polished wood of the counter. "Don't be a hero, friend." The outlaw snarled, his eyes cold and flat above the cloth. The men moved with ruthless efficiency, 2 vaulting the counter to empty the cash drawers, another keeping the terrified customers pressed against the wall. But the leader, a tall man with an unsettling stillness about him, did not move toward the gold. His eyes, dark and intelligent, scanned the room, passing over the wealthy rancher, the trembling merchant, and the wide-eyed clerk. Then they settled on James. He walked forward, his boot heels echoing with unnerving calm in the tense silence, stopping directly in front of him. He didn't look at James's money belt or his gun. His gaze was fixed on the single point of silver gleaming at James's throat. It was a small, plain locket, tarnished with age and worn smooth by years of touch. It hung from a simple leather cord, a private weight against his skin. The outlaw reached out his gloved fingers, surprisingly deft, and took hold of it. "This," the man said, his voice a low, cultured hiss that was somehow more menacing than a shout. "This is what I came for." Confusion warred with the pain in James's ribs. "It's nothing," he rasped. "Worthless." The outlaw's eyes crinkled in something that wasn't a smile. "Oh, it's worth a great deal. To me." With a sharp tug, he ripped the cord from James's neck. The leather bit into his skin before snapping. The man held the locket in his palm, his thumb tracing its surface. He leaned in close, his breath smelling of whiskey and malice. Some debts are paid in more than gold, Whitlock. The name, spoken with such familiarity and venom, struck James like a physical blow. He stared, trying to pierce the disguise, to find a flicker of recognition in the cold eyes. But there was nothing. Before he could demand an answer, the man stepped back. "We're done here," he called to his men. They slung their bags of money over their shoulders and backed toward the door, and their weapons still trained on the frozen occupants of the bank. The leader paused in the doorway, the stolen locket still clutched in his hand. He gave James one last lingering look, a look of chilling triumph, and then they were gone, swallowed by the dust of the street. For a long moment, the only sound was the frantic ticking of the wall clock. Then the spell broke. The woman who had screamed began to sob. The bank manager stumbled from his office, shouting for the sheriff. But James remained motionless, his hand pressed to his throat where the locket had been. The physical pain was nothing. A hollow, aching void had opened in his chest, a space that had been filled for 9 years by that small piece of silver. Inside it, protected from the ravages of time, was a faded miniature portrait of a young woman with eyes like a summer sky and a smile that could gentle the wildest mustang. It was the only thing he had left of Sariana. And now a stranger who knew his name had taken it as payment for a debt he didn't understand. The weeks that followed were a blur of dust and solitude. Sheriff Hollis Boone had asked his questions, his face a mask of tired frustration. James had no answers. He couldn't describe the leader's face, only his eyes and the chilling precision of his voice. The loss of the locket was logged as a minor detail in the robbery of $5,000, an afterthought to everyone but him. The outlaws vanished without a trace, leaving the town of Cedar Junction simmering with fear and the high prairie indifferent. James retreated to his ranch, a lonely spread of land nestled in a valley that cupped the last rays of the evening sun. It was a place built for a family. He never had the house too large, the silence too deep. For 9 years, he had worked the land with a grim determination, channeling his grief into calloused hands and aching muscles. He had loved Sariana McGraw with the fierce, uncomplicated certainty of youth. They had planned a life together under these same wide skies, until her father, a man of pride and property, had deemed James unsuitable and married her off to a wealthier suitor. James had never blamed her. He had simply packed his heart away, accepted his solitary fate, and held on to the locket as a sacred testament to what might have been. Its theft felt like a desecration, a violation of memory itself. Meanwhile, a new presence was making itself felt in Cedar Junction. His name was Silas Blackwood, a man who had arrived a few months prior, with a seemingly endless supply of Eastern money and an abundance of charm. He was handsome, articulate, and dressed in tailored suits that seemed out of place against the town's rough-hewn backdrop. He moved with an easy confidence, buying drinks at the saloon, making donations to the church building fund, and systematically acquiring land. He'd bought the old Miller Ranch after a suspicious fire, the Swanson homestead, when their well mysteriously ran dry, and he'd opened a new branch of the Wyoming Consolidated Bank, offering loans at rates that seemed too good to be true, only to foreclose with startling speed when payments were missed. The townsfolk were caught between suspicion and gratitude. Blackwood brought prosperity, but it was a prosperity that felt conditional, as if they were all slowly becoming tenants in a town he owned. James paid little mind to Blackwood or the town's gossip. His world had shrunk to the boundaries of his ranch and the hollow space where the locket used to rest. It was during a reluctant trip into town for supplies, his wagon laden with empty barrels and a heavy heart, that his world tilted on its axis once more. Winter had come early, dusting the peaks of the surrounding mountains with a fine white powder. A bitter wind whipped through the main street, chasing loose scraps of paper and forcing people to huddle deeper into their coats. It was outside the imposing new facade of Blackwood's bank that he saw them. A woman, hunched and thin, trying to sell a small, scruffy kitten held by one of her 2 small daughters. The children were bone-thin and their faces smudged with dirt, their eyes too large and haunted for their years. "Please, sir," the older girl whispered to a passing man, her voice barely audible over the wind. "We haven't eaten." The man brushed past without a glance. Others did the same. Their eyes averted their discomfort, a palpable thing. James felt a familiar pang of anger at the world's casual cruelty. He was about to step forward to offer a coin when the woman turned her head slightly, and the weak afternoon light caught the profile of her face. Time stopped. The wind died. The world fell away. It was Sariana. But it was a Sariana etched by hardship, her vibrant beauty eroded by grief and hunger. The laughter was gone from her eyes, replaced by a deep, hollowed-out sorrow. She was 29, but looked a decade older. Her dress faded and patched, her body curved in on itself as if trying to disappear. He saw the spectral outline of the girl he had loved trapped within the shell of this broken woman. His breath caught in his throat. He had imagined this moment 1,000 times, a reunion filled with unspoken understanding, with the quiet dignity of survival. He had never imagined this. Not this raw, public degradation. His heart, which he thought had been hardened into leather, cracked clean in 2. He moved without conscious thought, his boots heavy on the boardwalk. The children shrank back as his shadow fell over them. He knelt his knees protesting, so he was at their level. "What's this?" His voice was a low rumble, rough with disuse and emotion. The braver of the two girls held out the kitten. "Buy our kitten, sir. We're hungry." The simple, devastating words struck him harder than the rifle butt in the bank. He looked from their pinched faces to the woman who was now staring at him, her eyes wide with disbelief. Recognition dawned, followed swiftly by a wave of raw, agonizing shame that made her flinch as if he'd struck her. "James," she breathed the name, a fragile ghost on the wind. He couldn't speak. He could only look at her, the 9 years of silence and separation crashing down upon them both. He saw the whole story in the lines on her face, the death of her husband, the loss of her farm, the slow, grinding descent into poverty that had led her here to this desperate moment on a cold street corner. Without a word, he took off his heavy sheepskin coat and wrapped it around the two small girls who huddled into its warmth as if it were salvation itself. He stood and faced their mother. "Rena," he said, his voice thick. A sob escaped her, a sound of such profound despair it seemed to tear from the very root of her soul. She covered her face with her hands, her shoulders shaking. From the doorway of the bank, Silas Blackwood watched a faint, unreadable smile playing on his lips. He saw James Whitlock, the stoic recluse, and the destitute McGraw widow, and his eyes glinted with the satisfaction of a gamesman watching his pieces fall perfectly into place. Ignoring the stares of the townsfolk, ignoring the cold judgment in their eyes, James gently took Seriana's arm. "Come on," he said softly. "You're coming home." He led her and her daughters Lily and Rose to his wagon. He lifted the girls onto the seat, then turned to help Seriana. She hesitated, her body rigid with pride and shame. "James, I can't. Look at me. I have nothing." He met her gaze, his own eyes burning with an intensity that stripped away all pretense. "You have me," he said, his voice a raw vow. And with that, he lifted her into the wagon, her weight almost nothing in his arms, and turned his back on the town and its whispers. As the wagon pulled away, he felt a pair of eyes on his back, cold and calculating. He glanced back and saw Blackwood still standing in the bank's doorway, his polite smile a chilling mask. In that moment, James felt a deep, unsettling certainty that this was no coincidence. The man who stole his past and the man who owned Seriana's ruined present were connected, and he was standing right in the middle of their web. The road to James's ranch was a journey into silence. The rattle of the wagon wheels and the sigh of the wind were the only sounds, a stark contrast to the storm of emotion churning inside the cabin. Seriana sat huddled between her sleeping daughters, the borrowed coat a heavy shroud of both warmth and shame. Each mile that separated them from Cedar Junction was a small mercy. Yet it was also a mile further into a future she could not comprehend. She had landed in the life of the one man she had never forgotten, not as an equal, but as a beggar. His cabin was larger than she expected, built of sturdy pine, with a wide stone fireplace that dominated the main room. It was starkly masculine and impeccably clean, but an air of profound loneliness clung to the rafters like wood smoke. There was one bed, one chair by the fire, one plate on the drying rack. It was the home of a man who had long ago stopped expecting company. James worked with a quiet, focused energy, stoking the fire until it roared to life, heating a pot of stew he'd made days ago. He moved around her, never crowding his presence, a steady grounding force. He served the food in chipped enamel bowls, giving the largest portions to the girls who ate with a silent, desperate ferocity that made Seriana's throat tighten. He pressed a bowl into her hands, and when she hesitated, his voice was gentle but firm. "Eat, Rena." She obeyed, the warm, savory stew a shock to her system. It tasted of safety. Later, after the girls were asleep in his bed, tucked under a mountain of quilts with their kitten curled between them, she and James sat before the fire. The flames danced, casting long, flickering shadows that made the room feel both intimate and vast. My husband, Thomas. He died of a fever last spring. Sariana began, her voice a low monotone, as if reciting a story that had happened to someone else. He wasn't a bad man, James. Just not a fortunate one. The drought took the last of our crop. We took a loan to see us through the winter. From Blackwood's bank, James stated. It wasn't a question. She nodded, her eyes fixed on the fire. The terms seemed fair. But then the interest. It grew so fast. We couldn't keep up. When Thomas passed, they gave me 30 days. I sold everything I could, but it wasn't enough. They took the farm. Her voice broke. My father's farm. It's all I had left of him. James's hand clenched on his knee. He said nothing, but the muscle in his jaw tightened. He knew the predatory nature of Blackwood's loans. He was seeing the human cost of them now, sitting right in his own home. I've been trying to find work, she continued, twisting a loose thread on her sleeve. Cleaning, mending. But there's nothing. We've been sleeping in a livery stable for the past week. The shame was a physical weight, bowing her shoulders. I'm sorry to bring this trouble to your door, James. We'll be gone in the morning. No, he said, his voice so sharp it made her jump. He turned to face her, his expression resolute. This is your home now, for as long as you need it. You don't understand, she pleaded. The town, they'll talk. They will ruin your name. Let them, he said the words a low growl. My name is worth less than dust if it means I stand by and watch you and your girls starve. This conversation is over, Rena. You're staying. His certainty was an anchor in her swirling sea of despair. For the first time in months, she allowed a single fragile tendril of hope to take root. The next afternoon, a fine carriage entirely out of place on the rugged track to James's ranch rolled to a stop outside his fence. Silas Blackwood stepped out, impeccably dressed as always, his polished boots sinking slightly into the dirt. He moved with the unearned confidence of a king visiting a peasant's hovel. James met him on the porch, his stance wide, his hand resting near his hip. Sariana watched from the window, her heart pounding a frantic rhythm against her ribs. Whitlock Blackwood began his smile, as smooth and cold as Riverstone. A pleasure to see you again. I came to offer my sincerest condolences on your recent loss. He gestured vaguely toward the town. A bank robbery is such an uncivilized affair. I trust you weren't seriously harmed. I'm fine, James said, his voice flat. What do you want, Blackwood? Blackwood's smile widened. Direct. I appreciate that. I heard you've taken in the unfortunate Mrs. McGraw and her children. A noble gesture. Truly. His eyes flickered toward the window where Sariana stood. However, I feel a certain responsibility. It was after all my bank that was forced to take possession of her property. A sad but necessary business transaction. He paused, letting his words hang in the air. I would like to help. I am prepared to offer Mrs. McGraw a small stipend, enough for her to find lodging elsewhere, perhaps in a larger city where opportunities are more plentiful. All I ask is that you allow me to facilitate the arrangement. The offer was layered with unspoken meaning. It was not charity. It was a command. Get her off my land. Get her out of my town. Get her away from you. She's not going anywhere. James said, his voice dangerously quiet. Blackwood's facade of pleasantry began to crack. A flicker of irritation crossed his features. Whitlock, you are a man of solitude. A man of simple means. Burdening yourself with a destitute widow and her offspring is unwise. It will affect your standing. People will talk. I've already told her I don't care what people say. Ah, but you should, Blackwood countered, his tone hardening. A man's reputation is a fragile thing, Sheriff, as is his employment. The slip was almost imperceptible, a ghost of a word. But James heard it. A chill went down his spine. Sheriff. He wasn't a lawman. Was Blackwood confusing him with someone else, or was it a deliberate cryptic taunt? The town depends on the prosperity I've brought it. Blackwood continued recovering smoothly. They are loyal to their benefactor. You will find doors closing, friends turning away. You will be an island. Are you prepared to condemn her to that same isolation, all for the sake of some misplaced youthful sentimentality? The threat was clear, and it was delivered with the casual cruelty of a man who held all the power. James stepped off the porch, closing the distance between them until he could see the faint flecks of gold in Blackwood's dark eyes. "Get off my land," James said, each word dropping like a stone. For a moment, the two men stood locked in a silent battle of wills. The veneer of civilization was stripped away, leaving only the raw, primal confrontation of two opposing forces. Finally, Blackwood broke the stare. He gave a short, sharp laugh that held no humor. "As you wish," he said, turning back to his carriage. "But do not forget Whitlock. Every man has debts to pay. You more than most." He climbed into the carriage, and as it pulled away, he looked back, his face a mask of cold fury. Blackwood was true to his word. The following week, James rode into town with Seriana, hoping to find her some mending work to restore a piece of her dignity. He went first to Martha Bellamy's dry goods store. Mrs. Bellamy, a woman whose opinions were as sharp and unyielding as her corset stays, had always been friendly enough with James. But today, her face was a closed door. "I'm sorry, James," she said, refusing to meet Seriana's eyes. "I've no work to offer." "You had a sign in the window yesterday," James pointed out. "The position has been filled." She lied, her gaze darting nervously toward the street, as if expecting Blackwood himself to appear. It was the same everywhere they went. The blacksmith who needed his ledgers updated the hotel that needed laundry. Dunn, the saloon owner who needed floors, scrubbed all of them, had the same excuses and the same averted eyes. The town, in its quiet, fearful way, had chosen its side. By nightfall, the invisible walls around James's ranch had become solid and real. They were outcasts. The first snows of winter blanketed the valley, sealing James, Seriana, and the girls in a world of white and silence. The isolation that had once been James's solace now felt like a siege. Blackwood's influence was a poison that had seeped into every corner of their lives, cutting them off from the world. But within the cabin's sturdy walls, something unexpected began to grow. The house, once empty, filled with the small sounds of life. The soft murmur of Seriana humming a lullaby, the giggles of the girls as they played with their kitten by the fire, the simple scrape of chairs at the dinner table. For James, it was like a thirsty land receiving rain. The frozen ground of his heart began to thaw. He taught Lily how to whittle a piece of pine into a crude bird. He let Rose braid his hair into clumsy, lopsided plaits. He watched Seriana move about the cabin, bringing a warmth and order to the space that had nothing to do with the fire in the hearth. He saw the resilience in her, the fierce protective love for her daughters that straightened her spine and put a spark back in her tired eyes. His own purpose, once a vague notion of survival, sharpened into a fine, hard point to protect them. But he knew that building a fortress against the world was not enough. Blackwood was not a man to leave an enemy standing. His threats, his cryptic words about debts, the theft of the locket, it was all part of a larger, more sinister design. James had to understand the nature of the war he was fighting. He began his investigation with the one piece of evidence he had: Seriana's foreclosure. He rode the long 20 miles to the county seat, his breath pluming in the frigid air. The county records office was a dusty, neglected room, filled with the scent of aging paper and forgotten stories. He spent hours poring over deeds and ledgers, his rough fingers tracing the elegant script of property lines and legal claims. He found what he was looking for in the file for the McGraw farm. The foreclosure document was signed by Seriana's husband Thomas and a representative from Blackwood's bank. But something was wrong. James had known Thomas McGraw. He was a decent man, but not a learned one. The signature on the document was too fluid, too perfect. He found an older deed one Thomas had signed years ago. Comparing the two, the difference was stark. The foreclosure signature was a forgery. A good one, but a forgery nonetheless. Furthermore, the document was dated 2 days after. Thomas McGraw had died. Blackwood hadn't just foreclosed on a grieving widow, he had done so illegally, using fraudulent papers. It was a cold, calculated act of theft. Armed with this knowledge, James began to dig deeper, not into Blackwood, but into his own past. Blackwood's words echoed in his mind. Some debts are paid in more than gold, Whitlock. Every man has debts to pay. You more than most. The debt was his, not Sariana's. She was just a tool. He sought out Jedediah Stone, the town's former doctor, now a frail man of 80, who spent his days rocking on his porch, his mind a repository of Cedar Junction's history. James found him wrapped in a thick wool blanket, staring out at the snow-covered mountains. Judge Whitlock's boy, Jedediah, rasped his eyes milky with age, but still sharp. Haven't seen you in a coon's age. You've got your father's eyes. Stern, saw right through a man. James sat on the porch rail. I need to ask you about my father. About his time as a circuit judge. Jedediah chewed on his lip, his mind drifting back through the decades. Your father was a hard man, but a fair one. Believed in the law like it was scripture. Handed down some tough sentences. Made enemies. What was his hardest case? James asked, his voice low. The one that caused the most trouble. The old man was silent for a long time, and the only sound the creak of his rocking chair. That would be the Kane family, he said finally. Land dispute. Went on for years. The Kanes had worked that stretch of river bottom for 2 generations. But the railroad produced a title signed over by some government man back in Washington. Said the Kanes were squatters. He shook his head slowly. Everyone knew that land belonged to the Kanes. But the paper was official. Your father, he had no choice. He had to rule for the railroad. The Kanes lost everything. Their land, their home, their pride. What happened to them? James pressed a cold knot tightening in his stomach. Old man Kane. He tried to fight the eviction. There was a confrontation. The railroad marshals shot him down on his own porch. His wife died of grief a few months later. Left just the one son, a boy named Silas, smart as a whip full of fire and vinegar. He swore he'd get revenge on the railroad, the law, everyone who'd wronged his family. He disappeared after his mother's funeral. Never saw him again. Silas. The name struck James like a physical blow. He felt the blood drain from his face. Jedediah, James said, his voice barely a whisper. What did Silas Kane look like? The old doctor squinted, trying to conjure a face from the mists of memory. Tall, dark hair, had these piercing dark eyes. Looked at the world like it owed him something, and he was coming to collect. The description was perfect. The cultured voice, the cold intelligence, the chilling sense of purpose. It was the man from the bank. It was Blackwood. The puzzle pieces clicked into place with horrifying clarity. Silas Blackwood was Silas Kane. The land he was buying up wasn't random. It was a methodical reacquisition of everything his family had lost and more. His bank wasn't a business. It was a weapon used to ruin people the way his family had been ruined. Sariana's foreclosure wasn't just a cruel opportunity. It was a deliberate strike against James, a way to take the one woman James had ever loved, just as the law, his father's law, had taken everything from Silas. The stolen locket was not a trophy of a robbery. It was the first reclamation in a deeply personal war. This wasn't about greed. It was a vendetta cold-blooded and meticulously planned for decades. Silas Kane had returned to settle his family's debt, and he intended to pay it with the complete and utter destruction of Judge Whitlock's son. James wasn't just fighting a land baron. He was fighting a ghost, a man forged in the fires of a generation-old injustice, a man who believed with every fiber of his being that his revenge was righteous. And James Sariana and her children were standing directly in the path of his righteous fury. The revelation settled over James like a shroud. The world had shifted the lines between good and evil, blurred by the long shadow of the past. His father, the man he remembered as a pillar of justice, was now cast as the instrument of a family's destruction. And Silas Cain, a man he saw as a villain, was also a victim, a boy whose life had been violently uprooted by a legal decree. But there was no time for moral ambiguity. Cain's crusade born of tragedy had become a monstrous thing, and Sariana and the girls were his chosen sacrifices. James rode back to the ranch with a desperate urgency, the forged signature and Jedediah's story burning in his mind. He had to warn Sariana. He had to get them away somewhere far from Cedar Junction, far from the reach of Cain's vengeful ghost. When he crested the last rise overlooking his valley, his blood ran cold. The warm, welcoming light that should have been spilling from the cabin window was gone. The front door hung open, a dark, gaping wound against the snow-covered logs. He spurred his horse into a frantic gallop, his heart hammering against his ribs with a dread so profound it was sickening. He burst into the silent cabin. A chair was overturned. A child's doll lay face down on the floor. The fire was dying, casting weak, trembling shadows on the walls. And pinned to the center of the wooden table with a gleaming Bowie knife was a single sheet of fine cream-colored paper. His hands shook as he pulled the knife free and read the elegant looping script. Whitlock, the time for games is over. The sins of the father must be visited upon the son. I have taken what you value most, just as your father took what I valued most. If you wish to see them again, come to my ranch at dawn. Come alone. A final settlement is due. S.K. The initials confirmed everything. S.K. Silas Cain. He had them. He had taken Sariana Lily and Rose. James's vision swam the cabin, tilting around him. A wave of pure primal rage surged through him, so powerful it almost brought him to his knees. It was a rage mixed with a soul-crushing guilt. He had brought this upon them. His past, his name, was the curse that had led Cain to their door. He looked around the empty, violated room. This was no longer about land or money or even an old injustice. This was about saving his family. The thought came to him clear and unbidden. His family. In the space of a few short weeks, that was what they had become. And he would tear the world down to get them back. He checked his Colt, the smooth, heavy weight of it, a grim comfort in his hand. He grabbed his rifle from its rack above the door and a box of cartridges. The storm that had been brewing in the mountains all day was finally rolling in the sky, a bruised, turbulent purple. The wind began to howl, rattling the window panes like angry spirits. It was a fitting backdrop for the night ahead. Cain's ranch was a fortress. Perched on a high mesa that overlooked the entire valley, it was a new and ostentatious structure surrounded by a high stone wall. James knew he couldn't ride up to the front gate. Cain would have men watching, waiting. He would be shot down before he got within 100 yards. He needed another way. He rode under the cover of the gathering storm, using the terrain he knew better than any man alive. He left his horse in a sheltered ravine and approached the ranch on foot, moving through the dense pine and jagged rock formations like a wraith. The wind shrieked, tearing at his clothes and masking the sound of his approach. Rain began to fall cold and hard, quickly turning to sleet. Lightning split the sky, illuminating the ranch in stark, ghostly flashes. He circled the compound, looking for a weakness. He found it on the northern side, where a small drainage culvert ran under the stone wall. It was a tight squeeze, the stone scraping his back and shoulders, the icy water soaking him to the bone. But he wriggled through, emerging inside the wall, hidden in the deep shadows of the stables. Lights burned in the main house. He could see the silhouettes of armed men passing the windows. He crept from shadow to shadow, the storm his ally, his senses stretched to their limit. He dispatched one guard near the woodshed, with a single silent blow to the back of the head. Taking the man's coat, he pulled the hat low over his face and moved with grim purpose toward the house. He entered through the kitchen, a place of warmth and the smell of roasting meat, a shocking island of domesticity in this heart of darkness. He moved through the house, a ghost in the machine, using the storm's fury to his advantage. A crash of thunder covered the sound of a floorboard creaking. A flash of lightning blinded a guard just long enough for James to slip past an open doorway. He was methodical, relentless, his rage banked into a cold, focused fury. He found them in Kane's study. It was a room of dark wood, leather-bound books, and expensive whiskey. Kane sat behind a massive oak desk, a picture of calm, aristocratic menace. A fire crackled in the hearth. A grandfather clock ticked with maddening slowness in the corner, each tick a hammer blow against the silence. Seriana was tied to a chair, her face pale, but her eyes blazing with defiance. Lily and Rose were huddled on a rug, before the fire held in place by a hulking brute of a man. Kane looked up as James entered, his gun drawn and steady. A slow, satisfied smile spread across his face. Ah, Whitlock. Punctual. I knew you would be. A man of honor, just like your father. Let them go, Kane. James said, his voice a low growl. All in due time, Kane said, steepling his fingers. First, a history lesson. This house, this land, it is all built on the soil my father bled into. Your father, Judge Whitlock, a man lauded for his integrity, presided over a corrupt, legal farce. He took the word of a railroad baron over the lives of an honest family. He called it law, I call it murder. He stood and walked to the window, staring out at the raging storm. I have spent 20 years building my own fortune, my own power. And I have spent every one of those years dreaming of this day. The day I would strip you of everything you held dear, just as your father stripped me. He turned back his eyes, burning with a feverish intensity. Taking your locket was a message. Ruining your precious Seriana was the first turn of the screw. But she is more than just a pawn, you see. She is the keeper of a secret she doesn't even know. He looked at Seriana, his smile turning cruel. Your husband, Thomas. You remember him as a good man, don't you? A victim of circumstance. He laughed a short, ugly sound. Your Thomas was a coward. He knew he was losing the farm. So he came to me. He sold me information details about his neighbors' wells, their crop yields, their debts. He helped me ruin them in a desperate, pathetic attempt to save his own skin. He was my willing accomplice. Seriana stared at him, her face a mask of horror and disbelief. No, she whispered. You're lying. Am I? Kane purred. He opened a drawer in his desk and tossed a small, leather-bound ledger onto the polished surface. His own handwriting. A pathetic record of his neighbor's misery, all for a few dollars I never even intended to pay him. The forgery on your foreclosure. That was my little joke. A final insult to a man who sold his soul for nothing. Seriana's defiant expression crumbled, replaced by a wave of sickening grief and betrayal. The idealized memory of her husband, the one thing she had clung to through all her hardship, was shattered. Kane's attention snapped back to James. You see now the rot runs deep. Your father's legacy, her husband's honor. It's all built on lies. He drew a pistol from his coat, its barrel gleaming in the firelight. And now I will complete the circle. You will watch them die. And then you will follow. The debt will finally be paid. In that moment, James was faced with a choice. He could give in to the fire of his own rage to kill this man who had caused so much pain. It would be easy. It would be just. But as he looked at Kane's face twisted by years of hate, he saw not a monster, but the ghost of a wronged boy. To kill him would be to become him, to let the cycle of vengeance continue. He thought of his father, the man of law. He thought of the children, their innocent eyes watching him. Right's right, that's all. The thought was his own, but it felt like his father's voice. As Cain raised his pistol, James didn't fire. He dove to the side, rolling behind a heavy leather armchair. Cain's shot exploded, splintering the wood where James had been standing. The brute holding the girls turned, distracted. That was the opening James needed. He fired his Colt not at Cain, but at the lamp on the desk. It shattered, plunging the room into a maelstrom of shadow and firelight. Chaos erupted. Cain shouted orders. The brute shoved the children aside and charged into the darkness. James met him head-on. They crashed together, a tangle of limbs and fury. James was wiry and strong, but the man was a bear. They wrestled across the floor, knocking over furniture. Outside, a deafening clap of thunder shook the house to its foundations. James slammed his elbow into the man's throat, and as the brute gagged, James brought the barrel of his Colt down hard on his temple. The man collapsed unconscious. Across the room, Cain was trying to get a clear shot in the flickering firelight, making the shadows dance and twist. Seriana, seeing her chance, kicked her chair backward with all her might. It toppled over, sending her crashing to the floor, but pulling Cain's attention for a critical second. It was all James needed. He launched himself across the room, tackling Cain around the waist. They slammed against the wall, the impact rattling the books on the shelves. The pistol flew from Cain's hand, skittering into a dark corner. Cain was all wiry strength and frantic rage, his fingers clawing for James's eyes. But James's fury was a cold, controlled thing. He wasn't fighting for revenge. He was fighting for the future. He landed a solid punch to Cain's jaw, then another. Cain staggered back, his aristocratic composure gone, replaced by the raw snarl of a cornered animal. He grabbed a heavy iron poker from the hearth and swung it wildly. James ducked the poker, whistling past his ear and shattering a whiskey decanter on a side table. James closed the distance again, getting inside the wild swing. He grabbed Cain's arm, twisting it until the man cried out in pain and dropped the poker. With a final decisive movement, James slammed Cain against the desk, pinning him there. He pressed the cold muzzle of his Colt against Cain's temple. Their faces were inches apart. Cain's eyes were wide with shock and hate. James's were filled with a terrible, weary calm. The grandfather clock ticked. The fire crackled. The storm raged. It was the moment of decision. The end of a generation's debt. Do it, Cain spat a bloody smile on his lips. Be the son of the man who destroyed my life. Finish it. James held his gaze, the pressure of his finger on the trigger immense. But he saw Lily and Rose, their small faces streaked with tears, watching him from the corner. He saw Seriana struggling with her bonds, her eyes pleading. And he made his choice. He slowly, deliberately pulled the gun away and slammed the barrel against the side of Cain's head. Not to kill, but to end the fight. Silas Cain slumped forward onto the desk, unconscious. Justice, not vengeance. The cycle was broken. The storm broke with the dawn, washing the world clean. Sheriff Hollis Boone and a hastily formed posse summoned by James before he'd left his ranch arrived to a scene of quiet devastation. They found Silas Cain and his men tied up, the evidence of their crimes laid out on the great oak desk. The truth, when it came, spread through Cedar Junction like a slow-moving flood, washing away the foundations of fear and respect that Blackwood had so carefully built. The story of Silas Cain, the wronged boy who became a monster, became a cautionary tale whispered over saloon bars and dinner tables. In the days that followed, Seriana moved through a haze of grief. The truth about her husband was a wound deeper than any poverty. She grieved not for the man who had died, but for the man she thought she had married, for the life she had believed was real. James gave her the one thing she needed: space and silence. He did not offer easy comfort or false reassurances. He simply was there, a steady, quiet presence, chopping wood, tending the horses, his constancy, a silent promise that she was not alone in her wreckage. The town, humbled and ashamed, began to make amends. Martha Bellamy arrived one afternoon, her face pinched with remorse, carrying a basket filled with bread cheese and 2 finely stitched dresses for the girls. Others followed. The blacksmith offered to shoe James's horses for free. Men from neighboring ranches appeared to help him mend the fence Cain's men had broken. It wasn't forgiveness, not yet, but it was a beginning. A community freed from the grip of a tyrant was slowly remembering how to be a community again. Months passed. Spring returned to the valley, coaxing green shoots from the dark earth and melting the last of the snow from the high peaks. With the legal matters surrounding Cain's empire settled, the courts returned the deed to the McGraw farm to Sariana. It was a hollow victory. The house was dilapidated, the fields fallow. One bright April morning, James hitched up his wagon. "Come on," he said to Sariana and the girls. "We're going home." They worked side by side day after day under the warm sun. James, with his quiet strength, repaired the sagging porch, re-shingled the roof, and plowed the stubborn fields. Sariana, her spirit slowly mending, planted a garden, whitewashed the interior walls, and filled the house once more with the scent of baking bread. The townsfolk came offering their labor and their support, and slowly the broken farm came back to life. It was no longer a place of painful memories, but a testament to their shared resilience. One evening, as the setting sun painted the sky in hues of orange and rose, they sat together on the newly repaired porch. The house was finished. Life was beginning again. James held a small object in his palm. It was the silver locket recovered by Sheriff Boone from Cain's possessions. It was tarnished and bore a new scratch from the ordeal, but it was whole. He didn't give it back to her or put it around his own neck. Instead, he walked inside and placed it gently on the mantelpiece of the new stone fireplace he had built. It was a relic of a past that had been honored, a debt that had been paid. Then he took out a small new photograph, taken by a traveling photographer just last week. It showed a man with calm, steady eyes, a woman whose smile had finally reached hers, and 2 little girls standing between them, their faces bright with laughter. He propped the photograph up on the mantel right next to the locket. He returned to the porch and sat beside Sariana, taking her hand in his. They watched the stars begin to appear in the vast velvet sky, a comfortable silence settling between them. The past was at peace. The future was an open, hopeful land before them. Lily, the quieter of the 2 girls who had been sitting on the steps, padded over to him. She tugged on the sleeve of his shirt, her small face serious in the twilight. He looked down at her, his heart full. "Pa," she said softly, the word new and precious. "Can you read to us?" James's breath caught in his throat. He looked at Sariana and saw in her tear-filled eyes the reflection of his own joy. He had lost a locket and found a family. His long winter was finally over. He scooped the little girl into his arms, her warmth a solid living promise against his chest. "Of course," he whispered, his voice thick with an emotion for which he had no name. "Of course I will."